I'm excited to introduce the seminar because joining us today is Lauren Honig. And Lauren and I have known each other for a few years now, but I've always been extremely impressed at how she's able to think about framing research. And so when I was trying to decide who would be a great person to come in and talk to us about this, she was at the top of my list. So I'm very, very excited to have her join us. As you all know, she's an associate professor now, or at least close enough to an associate professor now, of political science at Boston College. She's the author of a book that is entitled Land Politics, How Customary Institutions Shape State Building in Zambia and Senegal. She's done a lot of work across mostly in Africa, and is just, I think, again, really, really excellent at what she's going to talk about to us in terms of framing research. So thank you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that introduction and for having me here today. I'm so excited to be talking about framing research. This is actually a very important part of the scientific process, but it also entails a little bit of creativity. And it's important because it impacts how our research is perceived, how it's understood to be contributing to knowledge. And so the way that I've framed this for today, framed it, no pun intended, is in reference to particularly comparative politics and political economy of development research, because that's what I do, but there are implications more broadly for social sciences in relation to this discussion of framing. And when we're talking about framing as well, I'm thinking about framing an article, framing a grant proposal, framing a book chapter, a dissertation, a book, etc. So some of these insights can be used to any of those different types of work. And I will say that when we talk about a theoretical frame or a sampling frame, those are different types of frames than what I'll be focusing on today. Okay, so to give an overview of the seminar for today, I'm going to talk through what framing is and why it's important, some how-tos, some advice on how to think about framing from the big picture to narrowing it down, some mechanics of framing, some examples. I'm particularly using examples from GLD associated researchers today. This concept, the pitfalls of breadth versus specificity in framing. And then I have a few suggested readings, and we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay, so what is framing? So when we're thinking about the frame of our research, this is a structure that situates the contribution of your research. And so the term of situating it, of really putting it into the broader theoretical and scholarly knowledge base is quite important in what we're doing with framing. So it's explaining why the research is important, again, how it's fitting into and improving what we understand already, what readers will learn. So we are trying to signal to readers what it is that they will take away if they read the whole project, if they fund the project, and how they will learn it. So giving some sense of what the methodology, what the how is, this is also part of the frame. So the explanatory or descriptive contributions, the cases and methods involved. And there's a strategic element to the frame because it's really signaling the audience that we have as well. So in signaling what your contribution is and in pointing out to what the contribution is, it's helping to show who is the reader that you're thinking of. So this impacts what types of journals should be publishing it, what type of program or organization should fund it, and who will read it. So one of the key audience differences that we might be thinking of in particular is whether this is for more focused on area studies, country specialists, or if this is more broadly focused on a thematic or a theoretical specialist. Is this about democracy, or is this about Yemen? Is this about the Middle East? So really the frame is how we're signaling to who the main audience is. Are these people who are already experts in a certain area and we're trying to contribute to their knowledge, or are they experts in a broader area or a different theoretical area. So this is important in terms of the framing, that signaling of the audience. But there's also an art to it. There's also a creative component to it because you're drawing in the audience. You want to capture their attention, and you, again, want to show them why they should keep reading, what it is that they should be understanding or taking away from your research. And so some of the tools that I'll talk about a bit more of hooks, puzzles, illustrations, debates, all of those are designed to draw in your audience and help them to conceptualize what it is that how they should be putting your work into this broader frame of knowledge. So in the drawing of the audience component, creativity is definitely a component, but framing is also a scientific endeavor. I really want to highlight this. So in the social sciences, the science of social science, we are building a body of knowledge. And so part of framing is showing where your work fits into that body of knowledge. It's situating your research, situating your project into this conversation and debate with other researchers. So this is really the scientific element of framing, that you're helping your reader to understand how this fits into the broader endeavor towards what goal or solution. What are we solving? What are we seeking to understand? And how are you building on what is existing already? And so one of my suggested readings for today was Geddes' Big Questions and Little Answers. And I'm particularly fond of this reading when we're thinking about framing because it's pushing us to reflect on how an individual research project is situated within the broader body of scholarship. And in this work, her argument is that large-scale phenomena such as democratic breakdown, economic development, democratization, party building, these all need to be broken down into smaller processes. And we should be thinking about the processes that contribute to the big issue, the big question, dividing these big questions into multiple processes, and then proposing separate explanations and focusing in different ways on those processes rather than the big compound outcome, and focusing on the implications of the big theory that can be tested. And so for Geddes, again, research, thinking about this science of social science, research is part of an enterprise in which we're building on, developing, and extending old theories instead of destroying them. So thinking about how you are revising theories, not just challenging a paradigm. And so we should be doing this when we're selecting a research question, and much of that reading is thinking about it as selecting a research question, but always thinking through this relationship between the big question and the little answer is also part of the framing. So for your paper, your grant, or your dissertation, when you're framing, that linkage between big question and little answer is really, really important. And that's how you show your scientific contribution. Okay, so I want to underscore this importance of both the art and the science, to say that the exact same project, the exact same research, the exact same finding could be framed in very different ways. And this has a lot of impacts. So the way that you frame research, even if it's the same project, this is going to affect how the research is understood by your audience. Who is reading it? Again, when we're thinking about some of the sort of professionalization dynamics of scholarship and doing research, who is reading it? Who is going to see this as a contribution, how this is informing their own research? That is going to impact whether it is going to be published and funded, and also who might be selected by an editor as reviewers of it as well. So you're really positioning this both in terms of the scholarly scientific contribution, but also within the community of scholars who might potentially be looking at this, reviewing it, making decisions about whether it should move forward into the world of academic publishing. So, and just really, really important. Unfortunately, there is no one correct frame. And again, any study could be framed in different ways. So the challenge is really to find the strongest option, to think through what could make the frame stronger, to think through alternatives, even to do a little bit of trial and error and be willing to change the frame a little bit following feedback. Okay, so in moving to the how-to component of this, my suggestion would be to start by thinking really big. So at this point, I know that you had a session on research questions last week. So imagining that you already have some idea of what your topic is, what your research design may be, what your research questions are, and then abstract away a bit and brainstorm, really brainstorm, thinking big. Use your whiteboard, use a piece of paper. Don't be shy about what the claims might be. This is the place where you don't need to narrow down. You want to be thinking big. So brainstorming the different major questions or debates that your project could potentially contribute to. And I think something that can, say we're really excited about a given protest. And you know that that's something that you want to be part of your project or a given set of elections that happens. Abstracting away from what it is that you're going to research and you're going to focus on into what is this a case of, what is this an example of. So if this is a protest, is this a case of democratization? Is this contributing to our understandings of how democracies develop? Is this contributing to our understandings of how social movements change? So really abstracting again away from the specific knowledge that you have and the topic or the issue or the project that you're really interested in working on, and thinking about how it could fit into a broader scholarly conversation. So when we're thinking of what is this an example of, you can think theoretically in terms of political phenomena, for example. Is this an example of political behavior? Is this an example of political participation, a social movement, forms of collective action? So you can also think about, what is this an example of empirically? Is this an example of former colonies, industrialized democracies, hybrid regimes, Muslim majority democracies? What is it that this project is situated in scholarship on? And so thinking through the bigger picture and abstracting away can then really help you to figure out what the best frame is among multiple options. So other questions that we can ask ourselves when we're thinking about framing: why does a study matter outside of my specific case and approach? So for this, why this study matters, you should be thinking about either in terms of real world outcomes. Again, the example of the protest and democratization, that would be helping that this is a moment which helps us to understand this broader process. And also you can think through as well what it is that makes you so excited about this topic, and how you see this as important and influential. And so obviously this is going to differ for any given project, but thinking outside of the specific case and approach, what's the significance of this project? And then I cannot overemphasize the importance of reading. All of the reading that you are doing, theoretical reading in your courses, reading a book that just seems really interesting on the side after all of your studying that you have to do for your comprehensive exams, etc. All of that is contributing to your knowledge base that at some point you will be drawing upon to think about how to frame your research, how to situate this. And so having exposure to literature, there just is really no shortcut for being able to situate your scholarship as in so much as being familiar with the scholarship. So investing time in reading, and as you're doing this reading, you should be seeking to test out the implications of those theories in relation to what your topic or country of interest are. So if this argument were true, what would we expect to see in Jordan? How would we expect this to occur? And so all of those are exercises to help us think about how we would connect the big picture questions to the smaller answers that we're contributing in our own projects. So reading helps us to think through what are the puzzles that scholars care about, what are the unanswered questions. And then I also think it's important to get feedback on your frame. This is something that all scholars and researchers do. It's part of the research process in terms of our research designs, in terms of our analyses, interpretations, etc. But it's also part of framing. And so hearing from your peers, what do they think is most interesting about your project? What is working about this framing? What is potentially not working about this framing? And asking them to help with this big picture brainstorm. What linkages to big research questions or issues do they see that you might not have thought of? So then once you have the big, the next step is to narrow it down. Do not try to appeal to every possible big picture question. It is true that your research may inform democratization, political economic development, party building. It could do all of those things, but if you frame it if you try to frame it to do all of those things, you will just confuse your reader and you will lose your audience. So you want to have an audience that you're contributing to, and you need to help to make that linkage very clear. So decide what your frame is, who you are appealing to, what the big picture is, and stay on message. So the task then, once you have the broad big picture, is to select the strongest frame. So among the brainstorm that you did with your peers after reading on a whiteboard, is thinking about which is most interesting to your audience of interest, which is most interesting to you. So say for the audience of interest, say you had decided that you are looking for funding from a group that focuses on the Middle East, that it's an area studies focused funding source. So you do want to incorporate, in thinking about the frame, what would be most interesting to that audience. Say you've decided a specific journal that you want to contribute to. You want to send it to world development because you really want it to be read by policymakers, for example. So again, you can think about what would be interesting to them, but also you should be thinking about what's most interesting to you. And especially when it's for your dissertation, for example, what gets you the most excited should absolutely be part of your decision-making on the frame. And then I would say the most important part of selecting the strongest frame is which option is your contribution the clearest and the strongest. So yes, it should be interesting to you and to your audience, but it really needs to be, it should be the one that the link between the big question and the small answer is really obvious and clear. That's what's going to make a strong frame, and that's what's going to make it clear how you are contributing to the broader body of social science. So, as I had said, this link is really, really, really important. The reader should know how you are contributing, how your research is contributing, and why it matters, even from the abstract. It should be a clear story, something clear that they'll remember and they'll take away about what it is you are contributing. And then that will be reinforced throughout the paper. Okay, so then moving into some mechanics. So the mechanics of framing, this can vary a lot. But there's a somewhat generalized social sciences model in terms of having an hourglass for your introduction and actually the structure of an article as well as an hourglass. You're starting broad, you're narrowing down, and then you're going broad again. And so as I said, this can vary. So another suggestion beyond this generalized model is reverse outlining. And so reverse outlining, what I'd recommend is select a few examples of articles or grants or whatever it is that you are working on, and look at what it is that those scholars did in each paragraph, in each section, how they organized it, not about the content of what they're saying, but what it is rhetorically or what it is within the structure of a paper that they're doing. And that this helps you to think through how the frame is being constructed, because it can be constructed in different ways. So just being mindful of the mechanics of other scholars' work that you might want to replicate in your own in terms of organization of a frame is a general piece of advice that I'd have in trying to think about framing. Okay, so this basic components of an introductory frame usually starts with a puzzle or a hook or a gap or a debate. This is the broad. Then you're moving into your contribution. We're getting more narrow here. So you're introducing what your argument is, or what your approach is. Why is what you are doing important? How are you contributing? How it is that you are going to make this contribution, which is the methods and the cases, and then your findings. So, and when we're thinking about this in an introduction, the findings, that is just a preview of the most important parts that you want the readers to take away and remember. And then we get broad again. So that's the broader implications. So here you read, it's still part of the frame, but you're reinforcing what the frame is, what you're contributing to, and why this matters for policy and or for theoretical knowledge. What is it that policymakers might be getting wrong if they don't read and follow the information that's in your project? If we don't have the knowledge that you are presenting us with, what's missing? How does this help inform theories, prominent theories even, of democratization? So this is really where you are selling the significance of the research, both for that social scientific endeavor, but also potentially for policy, depending on your audience. So then I wanted to highlight some of the common tools that are used for part of the more artistic element of framing, which is helping to grab your reader and to introduce in a compelling way what your contribution again is going to be. So the science side is how you are fitting into the social sciences, how you're building theory, how you are contributing to knowledge, but you also want to make that as clear as possible early on. So one example is to start with a puzzle. And so a puzzle can describe a surprising or unexplained outcome or phenomenon. So this could be theoretical, such as a puzzling inconsistency in the predictions of major theories, or it could be empirical with reference to specific countries, for example. So in a paper with Alan Lust and Adam Harris on land rights in Malawi, we start with a puzzle that to protect citizens and promote equitable development, governments throughout the world have implemented policies to reform and replace social institutions. They implement laws that prohibit socially embedded discriminatory practice based on gender, on ethnicity, on religion, and race. Yet, passing the law doesn't necessarily alter these institutions. In some cases, actual practices match the de jure law, and in other cases, practices follow historically rooted rules that are at odds with state law. So this is a puzzle. Why in some cases is it followed, and in some cases it isn't. And so we can also do this based on empirical cases in countries of interest. So in Marwa Shalabi's 2016 chapter on the challenges facing women's political participation in post-Arab Spring, the cases of Egypt and Tunisia, she starts by telling us that despite similarities between the Egyptian and Tunisian experiences since the onset of the Arab Spring, the two countries have taken different paths to democracy and to achieving gender parity in the decision-making process, okay? Different paths. We have a similarity, and then they're taking different paths. While both countries have recently enshrined women's political rights in their post-revolutionary constitutions, wide variations still exist regarding women's substantive gains in the electoral arena. Okay, so it's a puzzle in the sense that she's set up expectations would suggest that these things would be similar, but we need to read more to understand why they actually are not. Another approach is thinking about gaps. So here we're introducing a gap in our knowledge. And of course, the most important part of this is revealing why it matters. So the fact that there's a gap is less compelling if we don't know why it is that this should matter to us. So we can take an example from Ellen Lust's book on structuring conflict in the Arab world, which begins with this gap. The explanations for authoritarian regime dynamics have focused on regime types or personalities of leaders, while ignoring the importance of formal institutions. But formal institutions really matter, and you need to read the book to learn why. Okay, so then we have another approach, another tool that's used to help with our frames, which are debates. So here we're showing that there are competing explanations for a phenomenon. And then again, how your work intervenes, advances, or resolves the debate. Or a hook. A hook is designed, this is often an illustration or an example, in which you are drawing your reader in with a narrative that shows the importance of your project, that shows the importance of your approach. And you'll often see this particularly with books and book chapters, the narrative or the example being presented perhaps before the theoretical debates. But it can be a really effective way to draw your reader in and to introduce some of the stakes of what's at play with the frame. So the recommendation here, again, as I mentioned before, reverse outlining can be a really useful tool, especially when you are an apprentice in the research process. When we are learning some of the tools that different researchers use and scholars use, trying to be mindful of the organization and the way that others frame their work can be a good way to practice this. Okay, so then two additional components of framing that I just want to highlight are scope conditions and discussions of limitations. So just recalling that the frame is about situating your research. You're guiding the reader to understand how this research is fitting in and building on our existing knowledge base. So your research doesn't need to explain everything. Again, it can't explain everything. If you say it explains everything, people will be very suspect. But you want to help guide your reader to know when your explanatory or your descriptive contribution, when this is relevant outside of that specific country or that specific case or that specific time period. And ideally, you want to do this in a way that helps to reinforce the broader contribution that you're making. So for scope conditions, you are saying what the scope is of your argument, the scope is of your contribution. Under what conditions is your explanation most relevant? Under what conditions is it actually, should it not be at play? Should it not matter? And this is just, again, helping the reader, helping the audience to think about how your work fits into the broader scholarly community and framework and our understandings of political or social scientific issues. And then the same thing with limitations. Again, getting ahead of critiques is helpful within your frame as well. So you want to acknowledge what it is that your work is able to do and what it can't do, or what are some inferential challenges potentially with the research design that you can't get past. But this really helps you to be clear about what you are doing as well. So acknowledging limitations then helps to highlight what the contribution is. And again, that is really a key part of the frame, is to help your reader to really take away what the contribution is of this work. Okay, so I want to move into an example. And so this example is from a paper that Adam Harris, who's at UCL, and I published earlier this year, called Mutual Dependence and Expectations of Cooperation. And the initial idea for the project, the first real kernel of the project, came from observations during prior fieldwork about land titling. Questions about, does institutional pluralism in the types of property rights that people use in a community, does this impact community cooperation? Does it impact social networks in community? Does it have different community level impacts? And because so much of land titling and property rights scholarship is at the individual level, thinking about how this might impact an individual's incentives to invest, for example, that's a big one. But are there other impacts within communities that we should be understanding and thinking about, given that sporadic land titling is the way that much of the land titling occurs, particularly on the African continent today? And so does land titling have unintended community level impacts? These were part of the initial kernel of interest for this project. So, and again, I'm trying to stay away from the framing yet to just talk about what the research is. So then turning to the research design, what we did is we designed a survey experiment in which we varied the signal of whether a hypothetical neighbor has a state land title or customary property rights from the chief. And our outcomes of interest were trust and expectations of cooperative behavior. And we have a prediction. We have our hypotheses came from some of these expectations developed through observation during prior field work, about that customary property rights, that signal would increase trust among community members who both had customary property rights relative to a community member who has customary property rights and the title signal. And so the basic frame of this research that we used was a focus on collective action. So when we're thinking about, as I mentioned before, the big picture questions, things that are really important, bodies of scholarship, bodies of knowledge, collective action problems is a big one. And so the first paragraph of the article highlights that collective action is fundamental to public goods provision and development. This has been established already, and it's a really important issue. There's a lot of great scholarship showing that community, local, informal, and social institutions, they facilitate collective action. That's what's happened. That's paragraph 2. But at the end of paragraph 2, less is understood about why and how they do so. So we're setting up our contribution there. Paragraph 3 then says, therefore, we need to study the effects of mutual dependence on cooperation. So the basic frame is starting with this big collective action, very important for how communities access public goods that they need, roads and bridges, local governance. But we don't really understand how it is, the mechanics of how those institutions are working. And so one process that contributes to this is probably the effects of mutual dependence on cooperation. Okay, and so then later in the paper, we introduce theory and mechanisms that help to explain the interdependence among members of the community institution, why these would be a building block of collective action, why these would contribute to collective action. And such that two individuals with customary property rights, they're both dependent on the customary institution for their continued access to land, and therefore are in a situation of mutual dependence. Okay, but the basic frame, what I really want to highlight here is this taking the more narrow project, which is a survey experiment looking at this signal of different types of property rights and how it's impacting cooperation, but connecting it to a broader literature and a much bigger question about how local institutions can help to create collective action. And so one thing I just want to highlight in thinking about the framing and this big question and the audience element is the way that citations help to connect us to a conversation with scholars and to show that we're part of a scholarly debate. And so here you're signaling who it is you're in conversation with, what are the major works on this. You're also signaling if there's potential reviewer who's deciding if they should, an editor deciding if they should send this out to review or not, that other people care about this conversation, that this is an important conversation, what you're contributing to again. And so citations, particularly in the early part of the article or the grant, these are important for situating the research, which again is what the frame is doing, helping to situate your work. And so we can think, just to highlight again with this project, that we ended up framing it within this scholarship on collective action. Collective action is fundamental to promoting development and providing public goods in communities, particularly in fiscally weak states. Okay, so we're setting up the big picture and actually some of the scope as well in that first sentence. But you can think of many alternative frames that this project could have taken. This could have been framed to focus on and to appeal to land titling scholarship, an interdisciplinary community of policymakers and scholars who are focused on land titling. This could have been more framed to respond to the scholarship and engage in the debate on the roles of the state or customary authorities in community. This could have been framed to a more political psychology literature on distrust and trust. It also could have been framed to an African studies community. So this is all about rural Malawi and Zambia. Could have been targeted to helping us to understand how it is that local communities collectively mobilize and what types of dynamics of trust and mistrust occur in those communities. So there are different frames for any given project. And again, it still is all going back to trying to adjudicate among those frames which one is the strongest for whatever your goals are, whatever your audience is, and which link is the strongest. And so then here, this is actually an example of reverse outlining, but I'm also sharing it because it's an example of the broad, narrow, broad, the hourglass model. So we've already talked about the basic structure here. We had the puzzle, then we have the argument and the intervention and our research approach and our main findings. So those are our narrow things. And then we go broad again. And this is the implications for theory and policy. So we actually have a paragraph that's about implications for theory, and then separately we talk about policy. And here again, this is part of the frame in that it's helping the reader to understand how your research is situated in the broader scholarly community. And so that's part of what citations are doing, helping to show how you're in conversation with other work, but also it's helping to show why there are real consequences for your research, why this is significant for real world problems as well. And so again, the puzzle and the implications for theory and policy, these components are really, really key to the frame and to situating it. And so in this article, we have a roadmap, which is a pretty common in social science work as well. And that's that last paragraph there. And so I want to, as we get towards the end of this discussion, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of breadth versus specificity. So these are essentially two pitfalls that you may come across in your framing and that you have to be aware of. One is whether the frame is too broad. And so the problem with the frame being too broad is that you can be spreading yourself too thin, suggesting that you are able to answer questions that you can't answer. And so you might, if you have an extremely broad frame, you might be seen to be overpromising but underperforming. And you have to think through, does your research actually contribute to this question? On the other hand, it's possible to go too narrow. And the risk here is that you have missed your audience. So your research could actually have a bigger contribution to a larger audience, but you're missing engaging with them and showing how your research connects to them. And so a critique here that you might get is that it's too narrow. And so if you hear somebody suggest that perhaps this frame is too narrow, the question is, what is the bigger picture that I could contribute to with this project? So does this really matter? It really does. So for my paper with Adam Harris, in our first, we had to revise and resubmit for this paper. In our first round, one of the reviewers, let's call him or her reviewer 3, suggested that we needed to narrow down our claims because we were overinterpreting our findings. We were suggesting too broad of a contribution, need to narrow it down. So in compliance with that feedback, we did narrow down our claims. And then in our second round, our paper was rejected because a different reviewer described the revised manuscript as having circumscribing the most interesting claims and therefore was no longer interesting. So the key point here is that framing does really matter, that it is also failure is part of the process. That's part of how we learn as researchers, but that there's also no exact answer for what a frame should be. So there is the art component of it. We have the science component, which is thinking about how we're building into the social sciences, but we also have to acknowledge that there is a subjective element of it. There is a creative element to it, and also that it's okay not to get it perfect because there is no one perfect way to do this. Okay, so in sum, a strong frame something that we should really, really take away is providing the direct linkage from the small question to the big question, making it easy for the reader, the audience to follow this linkage, using a tone that's similar to a newspaper article with limited jargon, something really clear that connects the democratization, the party building, the economic development to the specific research project that you're doing. And then we also want to clearly reinforce this throughout the paper. So I've talked a lot about the introduction here, but once you have your frame down, you want to make sure that the entire paper is connecting to this frame, and particularly the discussion and the conclusion sections. This should remind the reader of the frame. This should help to prompt the reader's imagination about how this fits into other work that they may be thinking of within this frame. And then also the abstract and the title. These should include keywords that are cueing your framing, really to help make sure that the message is clear about what you are contributing to. So I had suggested 2 readings. that might help us reflect on framing that I find particularly helpful. The first is a Geddes reading, which I had mentioned before, that it helps us to think through those linkages between big questions and small answers, but it also is providing a really good guide to research questions. And on this topic about research questions, I would reiterate what's in this chapter is about her emphasis on curiosity, not on holes in the literature in guiding the choice of research projects. So and this is a direct quotation, she says, good research in the comparative field often begins either with intense but unfocused curiosity about why some event or process has happened, or with the sense of sputtering indignation at the patent idiocy of some particular argument advanced in literature. Okay, so what I take away from this and why I like that and appreciate that is because it's reminding us to draw on our own experiences, our own intuitions, and our own curiosities in creating our own research agendas. This doesn't mean that you ignore the gap in the literature or you ignore the patent idiocy of that literature. You still need to engage with it. It may, in fact, be essential to how you frame your project, but you don't need to necessarily be responding to the literature so much as your own curiosity and intuition. And then the Jaworski and Solomon piece, this is a short piece really designed to think about framing, particularly for grant proposals. And some of what they talk about here, they do talk about puzzles. It's good for a good reread for thinking about how scholars use puzzles in research, and particularly in a grant proposal. But I will highlight that they point out, do not fail to leave the reviewer with something to remember, some message that will remain after reading many other proposals and discussing them for hours and hours. So this, again, is all about how you situate your contribution. And as Jaworski and Solomon tell us in this piece, this is an art that is quite different from the art of research itself. So the art of framing is about messaging and connecting your work to a broader social scientific enterprise. So that is the end of what I had prepared, but I really look forward to answering questions and to discussing this further.
Thank you, Lauren. Not surprisingly, that was excellent. And I have to say, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I feel like I wish I had seen this at the time that everybody else is seeing it in their careers. I mean, this is really, really helpful. So thank you.